So hi, everyone, and thank you, Stuart, for your very kind introduction. So as Stuart mentioned, I will be talking about the character and connectivity of prehistoric rock art in Scotland. And in this presentation, I will be exploring in more detail some of the aspects that Tertia mentioned in her talk regarding our research, and focusing on what we have been doing and what we are currently doing with the data that has been produced by Scrap in the last 4.5 years. I'll start by briefly mentioning our main research questions, and you may remember that Dr. Alison Sheridan said that there are still many unanswered questions about Atlantic rock art, and the fact that is that we still don't understand very well what this rock art is and what its role was in the societies that created it. They're very basic questions such as who created the rock art, what for, and when, that we don't have straightforward answers for. So for our research, we designed 4 main questions that we're addressing with a variety of methods. So the data that we're using is that created by Scrap, all the validated records, which were created with a very important contribution of our community teams. And they're already providing a much better understanding of the prehistoric rock art in Scotland, and we are now having also a deeper insight into the tradition itself. So one of the main questions that we need to address is chronology, which is controversial. And we need to know when the prehistoric rock art was created in Scotland and how it changed through time. So we're working to offer a more refined period for the creation, use, and abandonment of this rock art, and also define an interval of time in which to place the rock art, which will enable us to include it in a wider narrative of prehistory. If we don't know when the rock art was created, then it's difficult to make judgments or assessments about its role for past societies. We also want to know what is the character of prehistoric rock art in Scotland, and we're defining the main characteristics of this tradition and working to understand the regional distribution and why it is so uneven in some places. We also want to evaluate the change of this rock art through time and understand the changes in its characteristics. And we're interested in knowing how the rock art reached the Scottish territory and what is the relationship between that moment and the distribution of the rock art in the country. For this, we're assessing the relationship between the prehistoric rock art here with other monuments, but also establishing relationships with other regions across Western Europe that may give us an idea about our own rock art and a deeper understanding of it. So in this process, we're exploring mobility patterns potentially associated with the rock art location, and also relationships between the rock art with maritime and other routes of mobility. And finally, we want to know who created the rock art and what it was for. This is a very difficult question, but we're doing this by assessing a number of variables that we will be discussing in this presentation and also in Linda's presentation after mine. So the term Atlantic rock art was firstly coined by Eóin MacWhite, an Irish researcher in the 1950s, and it was popularized by Professor Richard Bradley in the 1980s. Personally, I like to use this expression because it really encompasses the geographical distribution of this tradition in Western Europe. So you will hear me use it quite a lot in this talk. So what we see in all these regions where this rock art occurs is that there is a range of motifs that are shared across these landscapes. But there is more to Atlantic rock art than just the similarities of the motifs. So what makes this tradition a unified phenomenon? It is not the repetition of these motifs only, but a number of other features, such as the type of rocks that were chosen to carve, the fact that the rock art is an open landscape creation, the carving techniques, the way the motifs were structured on the rock faces, the fact that they are located in places with potential for accessibility to wider audiences, and eventually an ideology and a system of beliefs that was shared or at least widely understood by groups of people that were many miles apart and in many cases separated by the Atlantic Ocean. So these similarities tell us that these groups of people knew what the rock art was for and how to create it, despite the slight differences that we find, revealing some regional preferences which probably reflected the different cultural and social backgrounds of these groups of people. So we're interested in finding out more about these similarities, but essentially about the differences. Because if we are comparing cup and rings in one region with cup and rings in the other region, we will only get cup and rings. But if we look at the differences, then we can better inform our understanding of the rock art and these regional patterns, and also infer about the relationships between the different people. And for this research, we're using a multi-scalar approach. It's important to note here that we're using a body of data that is completely unprecedented, not only for the large number of rock art which we are recording according to a systematic methodology, but also due to the detail of documenting that we are undertaking, which focuses on usual parameters like the length and the width of the rock, but also specific criteria regarding motif type, rock media, and landscape. And so our multi-scalar approach will be divided in different scales, in 3 different scales, and in the end it will all be interrelated, providing an idea of this rock art tradition as a whole. So at a small scale, we will be looking at the motifs. At a medium scale, we will be looking at the rocks that were carved, the medium itself, and at a large scale, we will be looking at the landscape where this was located. And I will be focusing on the small and medium scale for my talk, and Linda will be talking about what we're doing for the large scale. So the recorded data is being categorized according to a scheme devised by me in a previous project, but which builds on work of England's Rock Art Project and also Blaise O'Connor in Ireland. And this means that we can compare our data to those data sets as well and have a wider perspective over the Atlantic rock art tradition. So this categorical scheme consists in the classification of the rock art according to a vast categorical scheme divided into these different scales, and they're all relational and interlinked. So as I mentioned, at a small scale, these categories and their variants focus on the morphology of the motifs and their making, the shape of the images, their structure, the grooves, and the carving techniques. And this is where the digital recording and the 3D models were particularly useful and important because they enable us to identify small details that are very difficult to visualize with a naked eye. At a medium scale, the rocks were classified according to the physical characteristics of the rock media, such as the type, shape, color, textures, but also according to the composition of the motifs and their organization on the rock surfaces. So the relationships of the motifs with the natural features were also considered, like hollows and cracks and so on. And we also looked at how the designs are structured amongst themselves. So whether they're converging, superimposed, or connected in any other way. And finally, at a large scale, we will be looking at patterns of landscape settings, the relationships between the rock art and watercourses, viewsheds, spatial relationships with other contemporary monuments, building on this perspective of landscape archaeology that was introduced in the 1990s by Professor Bradley. But what happens is that a lot of these variables, namely, for instance, visibility, were used uncritically in many studies and just taken for granted in terms of as considered to be a relevant criteria for the location of rock art. And what we want to do is deconstruct some of these variables and assess whether they were actually relevant or not for the landscape location. So in this table, you can see the main categories on the left-hand side, and each of these were divided into subcategories and each of the subcategories, or some of the subcategories, were then divided further into a number of attributes. The motif classification category is by far the most complex one that we're dealing with, and it really reflects the great variation of shapes that we encounter in Atlantic rock art iconography. And as you can see here, I have related each of the categories to a specific scale of analysis, which you can find on the right-hand side of this table. The landscape is missing because Linda will talk about it later. So this slide is showing how many panels per region we have looked at so far in relation to the small and medium scales of analysis. And this amounts to a total of 857 panels. This is an individual assessment, so we look at a panel at a time. And the map on the right will give you an idea of the distribution of the panels that we have looked at so far. And the majority of them are located in the areas with the darker shades of blue. And these tend to be the ones where the records are already fully documented, such as Argyll, Dumfries and Galloway, whereas we're still having some more records being coming into our database, namely from areas like Angus and Aberdeenshire. It's worth mentioning that for the landscape and the spatial analysis, we took a different approach. So we're looking at specific case studies that were defined geographically. And there's a number of reasons for this. But here we are considering all the panels that we have data for. So moving on to the analysis and the results at a small scale, we can start by talking about the type of depiction. So what is the type of depiction? Essentially, this category assesses the way in which the motifs were carved on the rocks and their relationship with the surface's microtopography. So we have planar types of depiction where the motifs are largely unresponsive to rock surface and essentially have a two-dimensional character. We have planar style where the motifs are slightly more responsive and they begin to incorporate certain natural features such as fissures and solution holes into the compositions. And finally, we have a 3D style of carving where motifs are completely embrace the microtopography of the rock surface, resulting in 3D images, as you can see on the right-hand side. This present absence chart is showing us that the three types of depictions have been identified in almost all the study regions. The planar and the plastic depictions are clearly the preferred carving types, but there are obvious some biases here in terms of the data, because for instance, in 5, we're only considering 3 panels recorded so far. However, what is really interesting here is that the 3D type of carving is present in quite a number of regions, and I would expect to see it in places such as Dumfries and Galloway and Argyll and Perthshire and Stirlingshire, where we have the rock art tends to be a little bit more varied or complex, if you want to use that term. But we're also seeing it in other areas with simpler types of rock art like the Highland. And this is special, and the special thing about this type of depiction is that it is more common in Iberia. So seeing it so well represented across Scotland, including in regions where the rock art tends to be less complex, is quite significant. So continuing with the small scale of analysis, we are now approaching the difficult category of motif analysis. This assessment focused on the very fine details of the motifs, the morphology of the carvings, the designs, the shapes, and all the variations, the characteristics of the grooves, and also the behaviors and the structure of the motifs on the rocks. It's interesting to note that the colors on this map shifted slightly in relation to the previous map that I showed with the panels. And for example, although Dumfries and Galloway was showing a darker shade of blue in the other map, indicating a higher number of panels analyzed, here the blue is slightly lighter, whereas in Argyll, the situation is reversed, having a lighter blue in the previous map and a darker shade of blue here. So what this is suggesting perhaps is that although we have more panels in certain parts of the country, in the case of Argyll, for instance, it seems to have a higher number of motifs that were assessed individually, perhaps hinting at more densely carved rocks. So this is something that we definitely have to look into more detail. For the motif classification, we have so far assessed a total of 15,801 individual motifs. And this was essentially the work of Lucy Killoran, who has been working on this classification for us for a while now. So the classification scheme that you see that we're using, as I said, is a combination of my work, Blaise O'Connor's, particularly for this motif category, and we have a number of subcategories for the motifs that you can see on the left, and we have a total of 190 attributes that are distributed within these subcategories. So we have cup marks, complete rings, partial rings, U-shapes, spirals, rosettes, and so on. And you can see from the illustration that each of these categories has a lot of variation. So if you look at the subcategory of the gapped rings, for instance, you will see that the circles can be gapped with or without central cup marks. There can be a combination of complete and gapped rings. They can have extended legs, be open on one side, have conjoined ends, etc. This present absence map or chart is showing the main motif categories and what is the preference for each region. So we can see that cup marks and complete ring variants are indeed present in almost all of the areas that we looked into. And these are indeed the most iconic designs of Atlantic rock art, so it's not surprising to find them so widespread. This chart is also showing us that almost all the categories are represented in the different regions, which reveal a certain uniform character of the rock art. And we could start to think that this is effectively the same carving tradition, although there are some regional variations. And this is not surprising, considering that we're talking about different groups of people, perhaps, and perhaps some of these people prefer some motifs over others, or there could have been different flows of people at different times carrying the motifs and introducing them at different times in the various regions. And what is really surprising is that we are seeing in areas where the rock art was known to be more monothematic, like, again, I'm going to talk about the Highland or Aberdeenshire or Angus, we are seeing that there also in these regions, we have quite a variation of motif types represented there as well. However, if we zoom into these regions, we can see that, for instance, in the Highland, in terms of percentages, there is an overwhelming presence of cup marks and only a small number of other motif types. And this is obvious from Alan Thompson's talk today, but we also have all these differences that we have to look into. So although the Highland and Dumfries and Galloway were showing a similar number of motifs assessed for each of them, at this scale, we can see that the Highland is distancing itself from the South, becoming with a less variability of a less variability of motifs. So in fact, we can see that this monothematic character is there, but there are some differences in the region. So this is starting to kind of show us the regional preferences. So besides the numbers and the detailed motif classification, what is interesting about this category is that it provides other types of information. So one of the things that came out of my previous work is that there are very specialized motifs that are repeated in 2 or more regions of Western Europe simultaneously, suggesting that there were connections between them. And as Alison mentioned earlier, these places were all connected and people were sharing their knowledge amongst other things. So I made a small selection of these specialized motifs, and you can see that although they may look like cup and rings, there is more to them than just simple cup marks surrounded by circles. And these specificities would not have been repeated by chance. You can see that these motifs are present in almost all of the regions in Scotland, and this suggests that there were connections between the people living in the different places of Scotland, and that people were exchanging and sharing their knowledge and their know-how of this tradition. So the coherent and the uniform character of Atlantic rock art suggests that some degree of instruction was involved in the process of replication of the carvings. And this idea is really striking when we look at motifs such as the ones I have just mentioned, but also when we compare them with later copies and how different the final results are. So on the left side on this slide, you can see carvings that have spirals and circles, and in my previous work I have considered these to be possibly Bronze Age or Iron Age copies, modern, and on the right hand side you can see modern copies of cup and rings. And because these artists or these carvers did not hold the knowledge of these small intricacies and of the making process of Atlantic rock art, or important information such as which tools to use or which rock surfaces to choose, then all of these factors may be revealing different outcomes on the rock art. So there is a whole package involved in the creation of Atlantic rock art that was carried, it was shared, it was adopted and widespread across a number of places. And that's why the Atlantic rock art is so uniform across such wide regions. So at a medium scale, we are now looking at the motif range. And the motif range tells us about the frequency of different motifs depicted in each panel. So we have a dominant frequency where one rock can be carved with one single type of motifs. We have limited, where we have 2 to 4 motif types, and varied, where we have more than 5 types of motifs being carved on the same rock. So in these charts, we can see that in the majority of cases, the compositions were carved with limited numbers of motifs, so between 2 to 4 types, followed by a prevalence of dominant types of compositions with just one type of motif. This means that they were carving the rocks with the same types of motifs, regardless of how many times they were copying them on the panels. There are obvious examples of rocks with a varied motif range, and we can all think of large panels with many different types of motifs. But the fact is that the majority of them was quite limited, and overall Atlantic rock art tends to be quite monothematic, as I've mentioned before, with certain types of motifs dominating the iconography. It's interesting to note that in Angus, without being one of the regions with a limited presence of motif types, as seen in the Motif Classification, it presents 43% of compositions involving varied arrangements of motifs. Whilst in Argyll, for instance, where we know about all the big rocks in Kilmartin, we only have 26% of these panels with varied compositions, which is a similar result for Perthshire and Stirlingshire, Dumfries and Galloway, and so on. So the medium scale of analysis also looks at the spatial organization and distribution of the carvings on the rock surface, classifying the panels into 7 different variants of rocks carved with one single motif to very dense compositions, irregular patterns, or distributions organized around one more prominent image. So although in some cases iconography seems to be rather sophisticated, some studies have shown that there is effectively a preference for simplicity, with the rocks being carved with simple arrangements of 1 to 2 motifs. And this tendency has also been noted by other researchers like Richard Bradley for Dumfries and Galloway, for instance, and other more recent studies. So this chart again is showing us that the majority of panels were carved with either single or simple strategies. So we have one motif or 1 to 2 motifs carved per rock, and a lot of examples are of motifs carved irregularly or with a dispersed distribution of images on the rock surface. The breakdown of the data into percentages shows that the simple strategy, where they would carve 1 to 2 motifs, is the more widespread, followed by the clusters and irregular carving. So finally, at a medium scale, we will now move to the motif behavior and the structural variants. And this category explores the relationship between the motifs themselves, either by them being carved with linearity on a linearity tendency on the rock surface, or a circular tendency to place the motifs, convergence of motifs, or superimpositions. It's important to say that superimpositions were thought to be absent in Atlantic rock art, but recently a few examples have been found, and we have been confirming this by finding a few other examples of this. So much of this identification is due to the detailed recording of the rock art with digital technologies. This category in particular also looks at the relationship between motifs and the rock surface. And this is a really interesting feature of Atlantic rock art. And in fact, it's quite intrinsic to this carving tradition. It's quite clear that there is a strong relationship between the motifs and the microtopography of the rock, and that the rock art is very reactive to the natural features of the medium. So these features and behaviors can be identified in most regions in Scotland. We see this relationship particularly in the way fissures are used to deliberately truncate motifs or organize them on the panel, creating divisions or delimitations. They're also often used as radial lines, but other parts of the rocks were also used, like the edges, acting as limits to the composition, for instance. So the way the motifs are organized on the panel and interact with each other and the natural features suggests in many cases that perhaps the artists had predefined designs that they were then implementing on the rock surface. So here we have a few examples of what I was saying. On the bottom left, a panel from Glassy that illustrates very clearly the 3D type of depiction, which of course translates a very close relationship to the microtopography of the rock. And here we see that the motifs really embrace the rock shape. So this rock was probably deliberately chosen to produce this outcome because you wouldn't be able to achieve this result on a flat panel. On the top of this slide, you can also see an example of how a cup and ring was very nicely put on the edge of a small block that's in drum trodden, or right next to it. Again, you can see how the cup and ring is in relation to the edge of the panel. There are other images showing this division of the motifs by fissures, or how the motifs were placed on the rock, considering the cracks and the natural fissures of the rocks. So finally, just to highlight the relationship of the motifs within themselves on the rock, the second image, the second picture from the left is from Castleton 3, and this is one of the best examples of superimpositions that we found so far. This is a really exciting find, opening new possibilities and understanding of phasing as well, which we can also see on the second picture from your right, where you can see that the rock surface chipped, and the motifs that were probably lost, or parts of the motifs that were lost there, were then recarved on the new surface. And on the left side, on this image here, you can see an erased motif, and these were completely unknown to open-air rock art until very recently, and had only been previously discussed for Irish megalithic rock art. So this intense study and the systematic recording of all this rock art is showing things that were unknown previously and are already telling us more about the rock art in Scotland. So what do we know so far about Atlantic rock art in Scotland? We know that we are identifying regional preferences with the type of motifs and how they're used and organized on the rocks, and also their variations. We know that there is a co-presence of some specialized motifs in the majority of the areas. So this is hinting at relationships between them, the way that the motifs were carved as well, and the type of depictions and the carving techniques that we are identifying also corroborate this idea. We know that there's a majority of panels that are very discrete, with some more prominent ones possibly in central positions in the landscape. And this may be linked to visibility issues, which Linda will talk about later in her presentation. There is an engagement with natural features, and this is a really important characteristic of Atlantic rock art in general, because we also see this across other regions of Europe, as well as the different regions in Scotland, including the islands, where the variability and the frequency of the motifs is reduced when compared to mainland Scotland. And there are lots of other patterns emerging from the study that we obviously have to, or that we are currently looking into more detail. So just to finish, there is no doubt that prehistoric rock art in Scotland is part of a wider Atlantic rock art tradition, and it reaches the country through networks of connections that were bringing other things such as people, animals, artifacts, ideas that we find in our archaeological record. And it's really important to create these connections and understand the whole picture, and rock art should definitely be part of this narrative as well. And that's all from me. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much.